So I spoke to Luke, and Luke said to me very casually that he sees 100% inflation coming.
Yeah.
And we know that Argentina's just gone back over 100% inflation. Bitcoin has just hit an all-time high. I'm not sure if you saw Preston's incredible tweet, but it said, try and stop Argentinians seeing this.
Yeah.
But in my mind, I know the country I live in has had high inflation before. But when I see 100% inflation, I think of Lebanon, Turkey, Argentina. I do not think of the US or the UK or Europe. And Luke's explanation is that there's so much debt in the system. There's only two answers. There's two forms of default. There's a hard default and a soft default. The hard default's unpalatable, so it has to be a soft default. It has to be through inflation. And he said, you could do multiple years of 10, 20% inflation. That'll take a long time. And he said the best thing is a short, sharp shock, 2-3 years of 100% inflation, like Israel, and bring down the debt to GDP back to 50%. And then the party starts again.
So he's right on the. We talked about this probably on our first podcast, or certainly our second. The exact same thing. There's two doors, right? There's always been two doors. Hard default, $400 trillion of hard default, and all of this monetary units and all the black pools of money, everything collapsing. That day would look like this. 3 days later, you'd walk to your grocery store, which would be closed. You'd try to get food off the shelf, would be closed. It would be complete chaos everywhere. And if you look at countries that go through that, it looks dystopian, right? That's what so that would come immediately. And that's why, so
it's not just unpalatable politically, it's also dangerous.
It's dangerous. And here's the thing, you wouldn't vote for it. We believe, like if you live in Twitter universe, right, or Bitcoin Twitter, you believe, because a lot of people would say, how dare the Fed do that? How dare the government do that? Well, they at the same time would vote for more of it. Because if their way of life collapsed, right, they think what everyone else should do, yet not themselves as a cog in that system, and what that would look like. That would look like you go back to the Stone Ages and you're bartering for everything. And Bitcoin would do really well in that environment because it would be the only thing that would kind of retain value. But there's a whole bunch of unintended consequences that it would be ugly. It'd be really ugly if that was, and you can see what that looks like for countries that don't have their currency, right? Don't have their reserve currency, because it looks like that, right? And it looks like that. How do they get out of it? Now, why that has implications for Bitcoin and why this is going to take a long time to play out is, if those people knew, Venezuela, Lebanon, Turkey, then you would think that Bitcoin would have 100% penetration there. But it doesn't. It probably doesn't have 5% penetration, right? So why, at 100% inflation, do people not change? And that's a clue for you wouldn't change either, or you would, I would. But most people, what Luke's talking about is they get the rug pull. And what would that look like in Venezuela, say, for example? Comparatively to the rest of the world, they just got their currency devalued. And now businesses, given it, if it was a decent government infrastructure, now businesses go back and invest in there because they're cheaper than the world, right? So everybody that's just got destroyed, wiped out, decides to play the game again, right? Because they think they're winning, because now you have this economic advantage, and it actually strengthens the US dollar, right? What ends up happening is the US essentially is strip mining the world.
Well, that's what we spoke about with Alex Gladstein, really.
Yeah. It's but that function.
Yeah.
And all of those people there think they're now they're winning. Now then you take that into the BRICS and what the BRICS are doing. And do you believe, is it reasonable to believe that with China's debt to GDP, without the black pools of money, right, without what's not known, you have kind of 350% debt to GDP, which is completely, no country in the world has ever created more debt faster. So China's growth miracle was a debt miracle that is coming due. 25% of their economy, about 25% was housing, which is coming due. It's not productive assets, it's store of value to be able to stop this, and it's coming due. There's no way to grow out of that, especially when that growth, right? Remember, prices fall to the product margin. Growth should be making debt more expensive, because growth is deflationary in our world. Does that make sense? Right. So when people talk about growth, what they should be saying is prices should be falling faster, because most of that growth is on rails that bring prices down.
So what would a true measure of growth be? Because you can't just measure prices. You have to have consumption alongside those prices to know. So
true measure of growth is productivity.
Productivity. How do you measure productivity? Is that hours worked?
Productivity is prices falling. So you have a mismeasure of growth. And so as you take more things out of the GDP calculation, photos, calculator apps, all of these things, videos, Zoom, all of these things, as automation does that work and those jobs are replaced by automation, then prices should fall. And that's net negative GDP. So then what makes up the difference in GDP? There's less things to be able to manipulate up in price.
So the GDP figures that are quoted, I even heard it this morning, I'll come back to that, but the quotation or use of GDP figures is part of the gaslighting?
Yeah, well, it's not part of the gaslighting. They actually believe it.
Oh, they believe it?
They believe it because this concept, what you started with, prices falling to the marginal cost of production, effectively, my book could have had one line: technology is deflationary. Deal with it. Because if that's true, then an inflationary system must steal that productivity gain that should flow to society, and it must concentrate it up into some people's hands to be able to make that work.
So why have they been able to steal it from some parts of the economy, but things like TVs, they just haven't been able to steal that? Why is that the case? So
again, you're mismeasuring. You know that chart that when you say kind of what all the some
things gone up,
all things would start at zero and fall in price.
Yeah.
All things.
Yeah.
What you're seeing, some things falling in price and something is rising.
It's relative.
Is relative to the system. And so all of those things, so TVs would have fallen a lot faster. Computers would have fallen a lot faster. Phones would have fallen a lot faster. But houses would have fallen too. Because energy would have fallen too. There's been productivity gains in all of those industries, right? All of those industries would have seen falling prices.
Right. So what really is happening is, with the mass increase in debt, is causing a redistribution of income unfairly to the haves.
To the haves.
Against the haves-not.
Yeah.
And when everything reprices, it will there'll be some proportionality to it, but the poorest will come out worse and the richest will survive it.
From the existing system.
Because the pie is still one size.
Exactly.
All we're doing is we're using debt to redistribute the pie unfairly.
So exactly. The debt's already insolvent. So who are you going to let win? Who are you going to let lose? The debt's insolvent. And so if people have leveraged up that debt that's already insolvent and you make the money cheaper, they pay back the debt in cheaper terms. But if they lever at the wrong time and you have deflation, then they get wiped out too.
Yeah.
Right. So you're playing a really scary game at this kind of end of days it's not end of days on a financial system, but lots of events could happen to flip it one way. And if you don't have enough time in that, if you're all in on a system and that it doesn't go your way, you're wiped out.
So you really should have some debt, some credit.
Well, I think about it as a barbell strategy, right? What happens so play the probabilities of different events, right? Let's use Balaji's bet. I believe Balaji's bet is essentially just a marketing ploy to be able to come back and be all in Bitcoin and kind of wash his hands of all the...
He's Bitcoin washing, orange washing.
I think so. Now, he might actually now get it. And he might... But these are the same things. Like that bet is the same thing that Bitcoiners have been talking about for a long, long time. And the probability of him winning the bet is, to me, so infinitesimally small. I can't assign a zero probability. But what that actually means if he wins a bet is you had a nonlinear collapse of the entire financial system.
Yeah.
And what we already talked about is in some nations, because it's going to happen in the US last, right? In some nations, as their currencies break down, they make that system stronger. So I don't think he's right at all. And in those countries, if you measured what do those people do, they don't all move to Bitcoin, right? They stay in the system. They get killed, and then they believe
they go to the dollar first sometimes.
So a friend of mine who climbs mountains for kind of hospitals and kids with cancer, he was flying into McKinley, and as he's flying in, I think they had to land kind of an uphill ice slope or something like it might have been. I might be getting it wrong. It might have been Nepal, but it was either McKinley.
Scary either way.
Scary either way. And they're flying in, and he sees this plane rolled over, and he's talking to the pilot and everything else as they're flying in. And he says, "I guess that airline's out of business." And the pilot goes, "No, that's this airline." And he goes, everyone died and everything else in this airline. And Russ looks at him and the guy goes, people forget. But again, what you're talking about,
yeah,
Argentina, the system has so much power over them, and they're measuring the system by the system, and they just, okay, people forget. What Luke's talking about is when Israel would quickly devalue their currency and then everything's good again, people forget. Right. And each wave of that is going to create more Bitcoiners. And each wave of that is going to kind of harden Bitcoin more and more. And at some point, there's this transition. But if you're living in Bitcoin, if you're actually measuring from Bitcoin, the only thing without counterparty risk to that debt, like everything in the world has counterparty risk to that debt, except for Bitcoin.
Hence, choke point 2.0.
Exactly. So, but if you're measuring from Bitcoin, then you're seeing prices falling to the marginal cost of production everywhere.
And that was the point I was trying to make, as I think that's what you're doing. And I think I get it now. I think it's clicked. Because units are increasing all the time. Bitcoin, there's a fixed number of units.
Totally.
And so even when I talked about the luxury car, it's cheaper in Bitcoin terms now
Bingo.
than it was 4 years ago.
And it'll keep being, in 4 years, it'll be way cheaper in Bitcoin terms.
I get it. I see exactly what you're saying.
And the existing system has to try to stop that. And if we think Operation Choke Point is something, if you haven't even seen the half of what's going to come to try to stop that. Now remember, the existing system that everybody believes in, if this just clicked for you, imagine how many times we've talked about this, right?
Yeah.
Imagine how that's why when you look at my book, it's going to predict all of these things, and you can see the next steps out of the actions that have to happen from the existing unsustainable system.
Even if there's an inflationary period, and Bitcoin's value in dollars goes up, but the purchasing power of dollars drops, that's irrelevant because at some point they have to still devalue the currency because you can't end up with $1 trillion notes. But at that point, so many people have moved into Bitcoin anyway, it's still trended towards the marginal cost of production. Either way, they cannot do anything about it.
That's exactly it. You're measuring the world differently. You're measuring the world in something that can't be manipulated. You're measuring the accurate, if prices fall to the marginal cost of production over time, and the marginal cost of production is falling exponentially because of technology and it's everywhere, then the only way you could measure that is through a fixed monetary unit that couldn't be manipulated. Everything else would be a mismeasurement. But we live in the mismeasurement